before I introduce the panel, and I'll have them up here in a minute, I want you to know that this panel is being sponsored by the Dove Men Plus Care, which has launched an amazing campaign, it seems to me. And Sheryl Sandberg talked about it last night. You may remember that Sheryl mentioned that at the Super Bowl, which for those of you who are not from who live in any other country, is the second most interesting sports event, you know, after the World Cup. Here, it's the biggest thing in the world. We think the Super Bowl, that does its name. And the World Cup, of course, which is getting a little bit more popular, is really the other World Cup. The Super Bowl is the most watched TV show in the United States, and that one single day. And what is interesting about it is that for years, all of the commercials were about men at their worst. They were either bumbling idiots, or they were sort of macho, angry macho guys compensating for the fact that they were now being henpecked and having to do more housework or whatever. So some of you may remember the Michael C. Hall Dodge Challenger ad from a few years ago. And what Dove Men Plus Care found in doing some research is that men were increasingly dissatisfied with the images that they saw on television of men. And in fact, in their survey, 7%, that's just 7%, said that they were happy with the kind of images that they saw about men in the media. And over 90% of the men that they surveyed found that they felt that their caregiving, their caring, was actually a sign of strength. So they launched a completely different kind of campaign, and we're thrilled to partner with them on this panel and going forward. I've been happy to work with them, to consult with them on some of this research over the past year, and I've been really, really impressed. So I thought I would share with you the ad that some of you, who may not be sports fans, might not have seen. I'll share with you the ad that they did, that this launched at the Super Bowl, and thank them again for sponsoring this panel.
Daddy? Dada? Daddy? Daddy?
Dad?
Dad?
Dove Men Plus Care. Care makes a man stronger. Share how care makes you stronger with #RealStrength.
I'm Adrienne Burgess. I've come from the UK. I work for the Fatherhood Institute in the UK, and we work mainly with family professionals to get them to engage better with dads.
My name is Michael Kaufman from Toronto, Canada. Over the past few years, I've been doing an increasing amount of work on issues around fatherhood, including some writing with Gary Barker. As a senior fellow at Instituto Pro Mundo, I've been working on the State of the World's Fathers report, which maybe we'll say a little bit more about as we go along.
Good evening, everyone. It's such an honour to be here. My name is Kate Gilmore. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Programs at the United Nations Population Fund, and I'm not a New Zealander.
Good evening. My name is Ronald Mincy. I'm a professor of social policy and practice at Columbia University. I'm a co-principal investigator of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey, which is the first representative survey ever of children, a birth cohort survey of both mothers and fathers that follows children now over 15 years and looks at questions about how the trajectory of parents affects children's outcomes.
Hello, everybody. My name is Francisco Aguayo, Pancho. I'm from Chile, South America. I work at Cultura Salud. We do research and develop programs and materials about fatherhood.
Why now? Why are we seeing so much of an upswing in interest in fathers?
Just at the beginning of the session, I was speaking to a colleague from China, and I said, "Is this happening in China too?" And she said, "Well, no, not at the official level of government and policy, but you speak to young men, and they are talking about their own role as fathers in a very different way than their own fathers did." We're seeing this right around the world, and one of the things that Gary and I have been suggesting in our writings is that it's not just that fathers here or there are rethinking what it means to be a father, redefining what it means to be a father, no longer just helping out, but being parents, is that we are seeing a global transformation of fatherhood. And in a sense, what it is, it's, you know, in a way, it's what feminism was for women. We actually think that this is what the transformation of fatherhood is being for men. Not just a global happening, but a fundamental transformation in self-definitions, in priorities. And we see this everywhere from studies that show comparable feelings between women and men in terms of how they prioritize work and family life. We're seeing these huge changes. But what we are seeing in recent years is how that's now being reflected at a policy level. So it's not only that the individual dad is saying, "Oh yeah, I want to be hugging my kid and spending more time," but finally the pressure of the combination of women's participation in paid work life and the transformation of women's life, of course, started putting pressure on men to do it differently. And I think a number of the men in this room, including myself, when we became fathers, were just told by our partners, "You've got, there's no choice. This isn't about, this isn't, we're not saying kumbaya here. You've got to do this work. If you're going to, if you believe in equality, you've got to believe in equality within this relationship." So first of all, the first reason is that men were pushed by women, but also men were just objectively pushed by the changes in the workforce, by changes in working life. But I think that the exciting thing for me is how it's gone beyond that, how it's gone now it's become men's volition. And when I talk to younger men, when I talk to my son, who recently became, a year ago now, became a father, I am a grandfather. We're going to be showing slides of my grandson in just a minute for the rest of the session. There was no question in his mind that where his priorities were, that he was going to be an equal parent. So we're seeing this, and we're seeing it in terms of not just a demand from women, changes in the workforce and so on, but I think really a profound change among men increasingly the world over in what it means to be a man, what their priorities are. And I really do think, and I think, as I said, Gary and I have been writing about this, that what we're seeing in terms of the impact, in terms of a sense of a transformation, a liberation, a movement of liberation, I actually think we're seeing that in terms of fatherhood.
Let me ask, I'm going to ask Ron a question about what your answer was, which is this a white thing?
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
I think, first of all, I think there has been a waxing and waning of interest in fatherhood over time, and this is one recent and important episode. But I think really that in part around gender work, I think 10 years ago, when I had the privilege of meeting Adrian and Gary, actually 15, 20 years ago, I began to have a sense, and I think it was shared, that there were diminishing returns to doing gender work, working with women alone. And in order to make some substantial progress, it was really clear that men had to be part of that process. And programs, when I first went to Latin America, to Chile and Peru, and saw how much of the work there 20 years ago had been working with men around reducing gender violence, and that work is now sort of imported into the United States. When I think about work in Africa, about increasing the educational attainment of women, that can't happen unless the fathers permit their daughters to do it. So, and have the cooperation of fathers in terms of increasing women's levels of educational attainment. So I think in a lot of ways, I think especially in the African American community, this issue has been important for decades, because of the disproportionate number of African-American men who are non-resident fathers, which is my area. But increasingly, as I point out in my book, Failing Our Fathers, which is just coming out, the proportion of 50% of all children in the United States who are born to women under 30 are born to non-married couples, and cohabitation doesn't last as long in the United States as it does in Europe, and as a result, fatherhood is increasingly important. And that's 50% of all children, not just Black and Latino children. So I think it's a quite generic phenomenon, and I think because it's generic, we're now paying more attention to it than we were 20 years ago.
Right.
For the United Nations Population Fund, we're in the reproduction business. And it's hard, not entirely impossible, quite rare, to engage in reproduction without a father being in some way involved. And the question is beyond the biological truth of that brief but no doubt pleasurable moment. There extends an extraordinary moral duty which to date in UNFPA's standpoint is unrecognised sufficiently. It's untapped, not explored thoroughly, misunderstood, sometimes sidelined, but such a pressing need for this engagement with fathers. If this isn't indeed an era of austerity and a time of great scarcity, how can it be that we would be wasting such a massive resource and such an extraordinary gift by either missing its strategic value, under-recognising its criticality for the human development project that is the business of getting a child to adulthood with all their rights intact? And how could it be that we would not hold accountable to that moral value such an important resource to families, to children, and fundamentally to the human condition? So that's why for UNFPA it would be like trying to breathe without involving air if you went about reproduction and ignored the critical role of men and boys. And importantly, I think not to confine the role of men to husband or partner alone, but to understand the particular value of father peeled away from partner, and to give that moral content and strategic value, I think is absolutely vital.
So on the personal level, what are the strategies that are likely to encourage more fathers to undertake hands-on care of babies? That is not fatherhood as some idea, some existential state of being, but rather the set of practices that constitute what, let's say, parenting. What are the strategies that are going to help men do this? And also, what strategies are likely to help mothers encourage this?
Right. I think, first of all, the main thing is to give them permission. There is no doubt that most of these guys are very drawn to their babies and want to be hands-on. I don't think in most cases that I think there are very few fathers who would go, "Oh, I don't want to have anything to do with that baby." I think the messages that are given out right from the minute that fathers come in contact with any services like midwifery are that they are dispensable. The mummy default is so powerful in those settings that the men are, if they're invited in at all, very often there's almost never guidance saying, getting the professional to look at both parents, to talk to both parents, to put the father's name down. Data is not collected. So all that sort of thing, so that's what you have to change. I don't think the focus on the men is so much. I think it's allowing the men to be in there. The skills and self-confidence is part of it. One of the reasons that men will hang back is that they don't feel confident. And so that's partly mothers as well. It's partly the cultural messages that are given out. It's the whole caboodle. It's the whole surround. And all that has to change. So we have to, and there are certain messages that I think are incredibly important. One of the ones that I find that fathers particularly respond to, and service providers respond to with amazement. They don't really believe me, which is when the research now really shows very clearly that women do not have special gifts with infants that men lack. Men's bodies change, hormones rush in, the breastfeeding hormone prolactin comes into men's bodies when they hold babies. And so it's that there's essentialist thinking there around the whole idea that women have special skills. And when you point out that this is absolutely not the case, that is one of the most liberating things for fathers. For mothers, it can be quite threatening. So you always have to be balancing what you're doing to help the mothers understand what a wonder it is and a joy to be sharing the child rearing with someone who is as competent as you are, who loves your child as much as you do. And it's wonderful all round, but you have to work on all those perspectives.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to talk about Adrian's point about permission. When there was an international conference on fathers in around 1994, 1995, and what as an American, it was odd to be in a context in which, when you talked about fatherhood in Europe, the major dimension of fatherhood was parental leave, right? While in the United States, the major issue around fatherhood at the time was child support enforcement. So it was like, how is this, what is this about? And one of the most startling things I learned from that conference is that many different countries in Europe had a couple of decades worth of policy work around paternal leave, providing legislation that would incent men to engage in more direct childbearing near the birth of the child. But the ubiquitous problem in Europe at the time was that men didn't take advantage of the leave that was available to them. And I recall in Norway at the time, policymakers were beginning to say, okay, we will allow men to take paternity leave, we will subsidize their earnings while they're doing so, but they failed to take advantage of this, and they gave it to the mom. And so what they essentially did was use the subsidies that was available to the father to extend the amount of time the mother was taking leave. And then what Norway said was, really, never mind, if he doesn't use it, we'll take it away. And so again, but the reason why they didn't use it was because it wasn't socially acceptable. They thought that in the workplace, if they were going to advance in their careers and they took time off to care for their kids, they wouldn't advance in their careers. So the issue is permission. Permission not only from, in the micro, from the mother and from the family, but also from the larger society, that taking time off to focus on the well-being of your child at these critical points was something that society encourages you to do. And I'm anxious to see sort of how that has worked out, since I haven't been in touch with these folk for 15 years.
There are many in the audience. They'll be happy to tell you.
I want to hear it. I hope we can hear that.
But yes, Pancho, go ahead.
Okay, well, I prepared a presentation. It's difficult for me to respond in English. Gary support to me.
Sure.
In Spanish first. Bueno, la experiencia chilena, voy a hablar algo sobre lo que ocurrió en el sector salud. En 20 años se logró avanzar muchísimo en el parto acompañado, y hoy día 80% de los partos son con acompañante.
In Chile, they've advanced significantly in the last 20 years. The increase, there was an amazing increase from the men's participation in childbirth, that now 80% of births are accompanied by the man present in the delivery room.
En ese proceso que hemos investigado, encontramos que la voluntad desde el nivel central del sector salud chileno, que atiende al 70% de la población, fue clave, así como la voluntad de algunos directivos o en algunos centros de salud de avanzar en este proceso, de incorporar a los hombres.
It was important to have leadership at the top, as well as that the health providers themselves were supportive of the idea to have men present in birth and in prenatal visits.
Hay otras barreras que vencer. Algunas tienen que ver, son muy materiales, como por ejemplo los horarios de trabajo. Esa es una tremenda o gran limitación en el sector salud para que los padres puedan participar. en algunos centros de salud en Chile se extiende el horario, que es usualmente hasta las 5 de la tarde, hasta las 8 de la tarde, y se incrementa fuertemente la participación de los padres.
One aspect was making sure that the hours, the schedules that the clinics were open and hospitals were open were convenient for fathers to come. So men getting time off from work was a huge issue.
Finalmente, como decía Adrián, trabajar con los profesionales es importantísimo. Encontramos en una investigación que le aplicamos la escala GEM a 1850 prestadores de salud, que aquellos con actitudes más inequitativas de género, cuando la madre viene sola, no le preguntan por el padre, casi no le dan ninguna indicación acerca de paternidad, y cuando tiene un...
Okay. Continúa, completa. Okay. They applied also looking at the gendered attitudes of the health providers. They did a survey with 1,850 health providers, applying an attitude scale about their views about gender equality, what they thought about men's roles and women's roles.
Entonces, cuando los profesionales en un control prenatal o en un control de salud atienden a una madre sola, los más con actitudes más inequitativas no le preguntan por el padre, no dan indicaciones de paternidad.
Those who had more rigid notions about gender, if a woman came by herself, they didn't ask about the partner or the relationship with the partner.
Y cuando atienden una pareja heterosexual y tienen al frente al papá y la mamá, los más inequitativos de género se dirigen fundamentalmente a la madre. A lo más le dicen al padre que juegue.
¿Qué fue el último?
Que juegue con el hijo.
Okay. When they had more rigid attitudes and it was the couple who was there, the provider only talked to the mother most of the time, and the only thing they said that the father should do was to play with the child. Those with the more rigid attitudes.
All right, I'm gonna go a little bit off script and to sort of ask a kind of provocative question. What we heard in the last two comments particularly was not the personal but the political. And what I want to ask is, the question, is involved fatherhood political? And I want to ask it in two ways. So those of people who know me in here know that I get very long-winded previews to the question, so I'm going to build up to this. It seems to me that in the 1980s, we, by which I mean those who support gender equality, feminists, progressives, lost the word family in the United States. That in the Reagan years, to be pro-family meant to be almost anti-feminist. And I think since the 1990s, and especially in the 2000s to now, that we're in danger of losing two other words to the anti-feminist right wing. And those words are fathers and boys. In the conversation that we have today in this culture, to say you are pro-father is often seen as anti-feminist. To say you are pro-boy is seen as anti-feminist, when it has always seemed to me that feminism has been the one group that we could always rely on to say, we need men to be better fathers, more involved fathers. We can't do this alone. So I want to ask you the question about is involved fatherhood political in that ideological way I just described? Is it a political football, and how do we address that? And the second, as you two both talked about, is it political in the policy sense? And that I want to ask Michael also to weigh in on the campaign around paternity leave, and to talk about the ways in which fatherhood is political at the level of policy that Ron also mentioned. So,
a number of the people here are involved in the international network MenCare, and not the Dove one, sorry, it's the hyphenated MenCare. And what it is, it's an amazing network, because as it was developed, there was a realization that the transformation of fatherhood to do what you're asking about. How do we actually bring about that change that I think more and more men aspire to? Couldn't just stand on one leg. And so as MenCare has developed in, what are we up to, Gary? 20, 30 countries? That it's sort of standing on 3 or 4 legs. So, working for policy change around parental leave, around just allowing fathers to be present at birth, that type of things. In many countries, actually running classes for fathers, for new fathers, for fathers to be. I mean, when you think about it, the women of the world have practiced at being mothers since they were little kids. I mean, playing with dolls while we were out in the woods, whatever, with our guns, pretending to kill each other. So, there's a bit of a dearth of practice. And so one of the things within the Men Care Network is actually giving men an opportunity. When our colleagues in Rwanda went to men in communities where men literally do not hold a baby until they're 2 years old, till a child is 2 years old. And they went to them, and these men literally didn't know how. And they said, teach us how to hold a baby. And so our colleagues there worked with a women's cooperative to make dolls, life-size babies, weighing right, and just teaching men how to hold a baby. And I haven't gotten to see them, but hearing the stories from Gary and others of just these guys there with their doll and just sitting around talking.
That's the same women who made your bags.
Who made your bags, there you go. And so policy change, classes, just to give the tools, the knowledge, the skills, just public campaigns, raising awareness, just making it the norm, naturalizing it, saying, yeah, this is what's out there. Things like, when I see these Dove ads, what they actually do, is that they're part of that role of just creating a new social norm. And the type of institutional change that Adrian's talked about, the Fatherhood Institute has been doing so well, working with service providers, working with healthcare providers. So we need all those different things, because I think the thing is that so many men aspire to these changes, but haven't had the opportunities. And that's where the policy really comes in big time. Because if we don't provide the support, it means that fathers are actually not going to be able to be the dads they want to be. So here's a concrete example. In the province of Quebec in Canada, where I'm from, so before a policy change there in 2006, about 22% of fathers took some sort of father's leave. That was way higher than the rest of Canada already, which was only 9%. Now, things changed a bit over the last 5 or whatever that is, 2006 to 2015, whatever that is, 9 years or so. So in Canada, it's inched up a bit because we haven't had any big policy reform to 11%. In Quebec, they brought in a dramatic new policy change that actually did what we were referring to in Norway, had a father's quota, said here's some use it or lose it time. If fathers didn't take it as a couple, you're going to lose it. They brought that in. They made it more flexible. They made it flexible for part-timers, people who weren't sort of paying into our social assistance. Their participation rate of fathers in taking parental leave jumped from 22% in 2006 to 84% in 2011. So it's such a clear example. If we don't have that policy change, we're not going to, the individual guy's going to say, I would love to do it, but I can't.
So I think about the politicization of fatherhood. To be pro-father is to be anti-feminist, to be anti-mother. For me, we've experienced at least 2 episodes of this in the United States from the framework in which I work. One is around the 1990s and the budget surplus that we had. The budget surplus that we had going into the 1990s meant that you could afford to operate programs that benefited men and women. In order to expand, for example, employment and training programs for men, you didn't have to cut services for women because the budget surplus permitted you to do some of both. Okay? What I worry about in the United States is that since that budget surplus rapidly disappears, we now go into much fewer resources, and as a result, extending services for men means that you have to cut funding somewhere else, and that's usually programs for women. And so the policy making and the politicization of it is a function of the resources that are available. And I also, through that framework, worry about what's happening in Europe. All the austerity that is taking place in the public sector in Europe means that you often have to make choices between extending programs and services for men versus somebody else versus women. And that's the way I understand the politics of to be pro-father is to be anti-mother. And I really think, though, on the face of it, it's really ridiculous. But to the extent that resources frame policy making, that's the way I understand it.
Adrian.
Yes, I agree, and I think there's an interesting one around this whole idea that. So I've lost my train of thought now. Yes, in Iceland they did a very clever thing. They decided to divide the leave up: 3 months for mum, 3 months for dad, and 3 months for the family to share as they will. So they were giving 9 months of well-paid parental leave. And that has transformed gender relations in Iceland, and what they've found is that increasingly men are taking some of the more and more of the leave that the family can share as they wish. Now in the UK, they tried to bring in a system of parental leave about 2 years ago, which was absolutely, from my point of view, brilliant. It mirrored the Swedish, the Scandinavian level. It had reserved leave for fathers. It gave fathers and mothers individual entitlement to the leave. And it was defeated, not by the government wanted it, but by a coalition of organizations. There was business, who certainly don't want men to be taken seriously as carers. They're happy to let women go on the mummy track and to work more part-time and to not use their skills and all that, but they are really scared if you suddenly they have to look at the workforce and think, oh, he might take leave. So that was one lobby against it. Another lobby was the trade unions, because they had won rights for women. And they were very scared that if men in the workplace were going to be taking leave, then the employer would stop giving benefits to women because they'd go, oh, it's too much to give it to both sexes. And the third group that lobbied against the kind of leave that we want was some feminist organizations. And again, their fear, they didn't really want men to have equal power within the family. They were very happy for men to help out, and that's what the 1980s was about. But what happens if men take a very substantial role is that they share power in the domestic sphere. And so it was very interesting to see that in a very political way was defeated.
Kate, yes.
Very much to appreciate this conversation, but perhaps to expand it a bit globally. I think the parameters of the conversation to date are in a relative world of privilege. I think the policy calibrations we've been describing around access to paid leave and father's presence in maternity wards and so on is not as universal a picture as we might wish it were. And I think we have to complicate the story of the politics of fatherhood and particularly in relation to motherhood and the family a little with the reality for millions upon millions, where in the context of abject poverty and in a fairly unreconstructed patriarchy, 1 in 3 girls is married before she reaches the age of 18. 1 in 3. Some as young as 8 or 9. And that is a number that, in terms of its sheer scale, is set to increase dramatically because there are more adolescents today than the world has ever seen before, and we're on an exponential growth in that regard. And so when we talk about fatherhood, we have to be careful that we're not in the Leave It to Beaver, or whatever the equivalent is, dream world here. These are units of families of coercion, of absence of consent. It's a nonsense actually to talk about in families that are created through forced marriage. It's a nonsense to talk about the involvement of fathers and husbands as if they're simply lacking in skill, motivation, energy or opportunity. These are sites of exploitation, of violence and of dehumanisation of that girl. And for me, that residual political reality that I would argue, dear friends, applies to many, many more young women than does the relative privilege of what we've been describing. That residual politicisation still remains fairly unexcavated in terms of the archaeology of the way men and women have related. No wonder that women under those circumstances cling on to the very little power they have. No wonder it's difficult to imagine that men may move into the domestic sphere and remove the very little power they have. No wonder it's problematic to watch constructs of fatherhood and husbandhood cherry pick at the opportunities of child rearing and childbirth and so on. So I do think we have a deep challenge to be genuinely political and a deep challenge to pursue and expose and denounce unequal power, whatever form it takes, whether it's gendered, whether it's aged, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's any other form of identity. And to the extent that we are transmitting and migrating that from one generation to another, we must stop it, and we must consciously go into these social roles of parenting and organise them, male and female, or any other form in which we care to identify ourselves. We must organise them in such a manner as to democratise the most intimate of spaces, starting with the bedroom, going into the household, into the family unit, which must be democratised, and it is not. And I would still argue that it's women, I am afraid, who bear the burden of that absence of intimate democracy.
I think that is a really, really important corrective to some of the first world problem issues that, as we've described them. So what, Kate, are the kinds of policies that you see from where you sit at UNFPA? What are the kinds of policies that you're talking about? Not, perhaps, greater access to paternity leave, use or lose policies, or, daddies are us kind of things, but rather, the kind of political policies around gender relations in the places that you're describing. Could you talk about some of them for us?
Well, let me just give you 3 very brief examples, and then I'll shut up.
No.
No, well, the first and most important thing for UNFPA is comprehensive sexuality education. Let me be clear that for us, the change agenda starts long before people pair off to be mother-father or to form a family. That at the get-go, we have to, across the whole education system, and fortunately in the last 20 years or so, we have seen, at least at primary school level, a shift of girls' access to primary school and a retention of both boys and girls in primary school and into secondary school. It opens up an opportunity for us to understand that the transmission of information, of education, and therefore of informed choice is a fundamental duty in school curriculum. And that comprehensive sexuality education has to be made mandatory and has to become part of core curriculum. And for UNFPA, along with many partners right across our 120 country office presences, that's one of the most pressing public policy agendas that we promote. But the second most critical thing is that we must understand how complicit adults are in the derailing of a girl's life the minute she hits puberty. And the minute she hits puberty, when recalling that puberty's actually gone down by some 5 years or so over the last 50 years, the young girl at the age of 10 just encounters an onslaught of attack against her at the same time as a young man's opportunities expand. As his autonomy increases and greater freedom to move from the house and into public spaces, her world contracts. It contracts under the force of marriage, or it contracts under the force of being confined to the home out of fear. She's more subjected to sexual violence. She's more likely to become pregnant. She can be married off, but she can't go and see a doctor on her own. She can be pregnant, but she can't have access to contraceptives. She can enter into sexual congress with or without consent, but cannot know what's required to avoid her catching sexually transmitted infection. And as a consequence, for adolescents in this world, deaths from HIV and AIDS has gone up by 30%, while it's gone down for the rest of us by the same amount. Right. We are killing our young people through a failure to engage in comprehensive sexuality education. The final thing that we would press, and we meet fierce resistance about this, but I do want to emphasise this very dry policy initiative, and that is civil registration. There is such an energy for birth registration and for cause of death registration, and we salute that. But do you know how much resistance there is to marriage registration? How much resistance there is from both the West and other countries. And yet without marriage registration, girls are disappearing from public life. They're disappearing in their legal status, and their rights are completely being deprived. And so unless that pathway into that moment where they have a husband and a father with whom to negotiate ideal child rearing, unless that pathway is also paved with rights, then I think we're in a more privileged conversation than we really intend to be. And I know this is a genuine concern.
I know. Now, you see, this is why I like this. Because here we were feeling all so good. And you, Kate, you have pulled us back from the edge of that kind of self-congratulatory position. I think it's exactly where we want to be. And everybody now wants to respond to this. I'm going to let Pancho say something, being from the Global South, to respond to some of this. But everyone's going to get their chance, I promise you.
Gracias. Algo que diría desde el sur o de Latinoamérica es que, bueno, por un lado hay una gran preocupación porque va creciendo la carga de cuidado y las mujeres son las que siguen en su mayoría cuidando a los hijos, a las personas con problemas de salud mental, a los ancianos.
From the Global South or Latin American view, in spite of women's entrance in the workplace, etc., the care burden continues to fit squarely on women, both the care in the home as well as the elderly and those who are sick.
Entonces, lo que ha crecido fuertemente es como un discurso acerca de la paternidad, pero en realidad un discurso sobre todo afectivo de la comunicación con los hijos, pero estamos muy lejos todavía en el sur, en mi opinión, de pensar en que nos podemos acercar como a la equidad de género en el cuidado.
So there's been a change in discourse, but it's very much focused on sort of the care, the softer side of fatherhood, that is the connection, the emotional connection to children, but that it has not been met with an equity in terms of who does the daily caregiving. And in fact, that seems a long way off.
Por último, decir algo acerca desde el punto de vista del Estado, cómo el Estado se aproxima a este tema, en mi opinión, con un ejemplo. Chile, que es un país de mediano ingreso, cambió su postnatal hace 2 años y fue ampliado de 3 meses a 5 meses y medio para las madres.
Chile has extended maternity leave from 3 months to 5 months, maternity, so just for mothers.
Y las últimas 6 semanas la madre lo puede transferir al padre.
The last 6 weeks, the mother is allowed to transfer them to the father.
Entonces hubo mucho discurso en Chile del mundo político, el Estado se vanagloriaba de esta acción como que ahora teníamos un gran postnatal masculino, digamos, que podía ser de 6 semanas.
So policymakers said, wow, we did this great thing of 6 weeks that could be transferred to the mother, to the father, showing how much we are investing in equitable fatherhood.
Pero hacer con un formato de que la madre lo transfiere, en la práctica solo un 0,2% de los casos hombres han tomado este postnatal.
So this great advance, 0.2% of fathers have used some of that 6 weeks.
Wow. Con este ejemplo lo que queremos decir es que el Estado puede decir queremos cambiar el orden de género o hacer que los hombres se involucren en el cuidado, pero en realidad este es un ejemplo de que no hubo la voluntad política, en realidad fue reforzar que son las mujeres las que tienen que cuidar.
So the state can give a sense, or the government can give a sense it's doing something to nudge men toward doing more caregiving, but in fact it's done nothing but maintain the status quo.
The particulars that Kate just talked about in terms of differences in age at marriage and the way they create an exploitative framework for girls are what I meant and failed to articulate when we think about diminishing returns on women's issues by working only with women. Because the power relationships inside the family and inside society clearly rest with men. And you can't make any progress on the issues that Kate talked about unless you genuinely engage men in the process. That's what I meant. And so I discovered this in the 1990s again when I was at the Ford Foundation, and the agenda moved from women's health to reproductive health. And then when I began to work with some of my colleagues in Peru and in Chile and saw the work that they were doing, I was asking my colleagues at Ford, it's impossible to make the gains that you want to make unless you bring men into the process. And it was very difficult for grant makers who had limited amounts of money and who were working all over the world to think about using some of those limited resources to engage men in the conversation. But unless they do so, clearly the barriers that Kate is worried about can't be broken down. And so I think that's a critical part of, particularly, you know, in third world countries, how we're going to make progress on these issues is to get men engaged. Not only the men who are directly engaged in these families, but the men who are controlling the power structure, control the law, control the ways in these issues are framed.
I mean, asking whether, you know, what does involve fatherhood, what's it about politically? What's it about politically? I mean, patriarchy is the rule of the father. I mean, that's what the term's all about. So the transformation, the demolishing of patriarchy, I believe has to involve that challenge to that power role of the father. So what does that mean concretely? Well, it means concretely, for example, if Pancho was referring to the care burden of women. In the global south, where women are doing 2 to 10 times as much of the care work in terms of just the household tasks as men, by the engagement of men as fathers, by the transformation of men's roles within the family, from being the patriarch to being a caregiver, to doing 50% of the care work, which is not just holding the baby, but doing the cooking and doing the cleaning and all those jobs that don't look quite as pretty in the TV ads, but you know, washing the toilet, all those things. And that's part of the care work. And I'd like to see some more images of scrubbing the toilets and not just throwing the kids in the air. Just a little thing to our advertising colleagues here. You know, we don't need, you know, as we used to say, we don't need more Iron Johns, we need more ironing Johns. I mean, that was,
right.
So, you know, so that transformation is one of the key things that will make a substantial contribution to women's, to the transformation of women's lives. Similarly for children. You know, men are still the gatekeepers, both at the political level, the religious level, and at the family level of the patriarchal order. So when we talk about the transformation of fatherhood, it's not just about, you know, oh, this is sweet and nice and we can only do this in the global north. This is a worldwide change, not only that we need, but I believe is actually happening at different levels. And it is going to be the profound thing that is going to change men's lives, that is going to lift women's care burden, and I think will actually transform the lives of children. And so if men redefine ourselves, as we redefine ourselves as caregivers, it means those abominable practices that you thankfully, you know, not thankfully, but that you're referring to, are things that I believe will be more and more inconceivable for any man to ever do.
Right. Adrian, your last word.
Yes, I don't see why we have to think about these families in the global south as though these men are inhumane. I think it's exactly the kind of approach which is to get men involved, handling babies, getting involved and feeling that powerful connection. And I don't see why we have to treat those families as though that can't happen. Right. Years ago, when in Britain we had the terrible troubles in Northern Ireland, where the Catholics and the Protestants were at each other's throats and there was violence every day, a worker in the area said to me, "Oh, Adrian," he said, "you just get the guys handling the babies, get them looking after the babies, and everything changes."
Right, that's right. I'm going to end our session because I've been given the signal that our time is up. And I just want to say that what I think is happening in this conversation, and the arc of this conversation from the ad that we saw earlier to this conversation now, is very often, I think, that the conversation about fathers works at the level of norms. Men should do, fathers should be. And rather, I think what the State of the World's Fathers research has shown, what the Dove Men Plus Care research has shown, what your research has shown is something different. It's a description. This is what men are already doing. This is a global transformation. This is why we need such good research about the actual transformation in men's lives. And Michael, I think, put it best, because the good research that tells us not what men should be doing, which is hard to get men to engage with, but what men already are doing, listening to what men's hearts are telling them that they want to do, if they could do it in the workplace in the global north, if they could do it in their families in the global south, if they were able to hold a baby before age 2, you know, in Rwanda, they would do so. That is to celebrate the changes that are already happening. We need really great research to do that. This is the place where the fatherhood activism comes together with the fatherhood research. And I believe, as you do, Michael, that this is a most powerful transformation, number one, and number two, that's the way to combat the effort to take the word father away from those of us who support gender equality. Thank you all very much. Have a great dinner, drink some great beer, watch some great movies. See you tomorrow.